The first log came out of the swamp at 6:17 on a cold October morning. Mara Bennett stood ankle-deep in black water, one hand wrapped around the control of an old logging winch, watching the steel cable tighten until it hummed. For several seconds nothing happened. Then the mud moved. A line of bubbles broke the surface 20 yards away. Reeds leaned sideways. Somewhere beneath them, something enormous shifted as the winch groaned against its anchor. Mara released the switch. Silence returned. She stared at the place where the bubbles had appeared. Whatever was buried down there was heavier than she'd expected. She tightened the cable again. This time the swamp gave it up. One end of a massive trunk rose through the black water. Then 6 feet, 10, 20. Mud rolled from the wood as it slid slowly toward firmer ground. By the time the entire log lay beside the swamp, Mara could barely believe what she was looking at. It was nearly 3 feet across. There was no bark left, no branches, no roots. Just a long, straight trunk stained almost completely black. To anyone driving past, it would have looked like a dead tree the swamp had been digesting for decades. Maybe longer. Mara almost believed the same thing. Almost. She walked along the trunk and knelt beside one end. Beneath the mud were several marks that didn't look natural, straight cuts. Old ones. Someone had handled this tree before it disappeared beneath the swamp. Mara brought over a chainsaw. The first bite of the blade threw black water and softened debris across her boots. Then the sawdust changed. Black became brown. Brown became pale gold. Mara stopped cutting. The outside looked dead, the inside didn't. The grain was tight, solid. Far better preserved than anything that had spent generations underwater. Had a right to look. That single cut changed the way Mara saw the southern 40 acres of her farm. Everyone had called them useless. Too wet for crops, too soft for machinery, too expensive to drain, but nobody who had valued the property had crawled through that water with a steel probe. Mara had within weeks. She began finding more trunks, dozens, then hundreds. What began as a recovery experiment became a survey. What began as a survey became an operation, and over the next several years, one black trunk after another would come out of the mud. Some were rotten, some split, some cost more to recover than they returned, but enough survived. By the final season, Mara's recovery ledger would contain one number nobody who had seen the original farm would have believed. 1,700 black logs pulled from beneath 40 acres. Everyone had treated as nearly worthless. Yet the number wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was what happened after those logs came out. Because Mara would eventually discover that the best wood beneath the swamp was worth more than she had paid for the entire farm above it. And it had been there the whole time, hidden under black water. Back then she hadn't called it a swamp. She called it 40 acres she couldn't use. The farm had been on the market for almost 3 years, 112 acres of tired pasture. An aging farmhouse, 2 collapsing sheds, and a barn with enough holes in the roof to see daylight through it. But the southern end was what drove buyers away. Water stood between the trees even in late summer. Old fence posts leaned at strange angles along the edge. Alder and willow had swallowed whatever pasture might once have existed there, and beneath them lay mud deep enough to trap a tractor. The real estate agent stopped 20 feet from the water. "Nothing much you can do with that section," he said. Mara looked across the reeds. "Drain it," he shook his head. "Probably cost more than it's worth." That sentence stayed with her. More than it's worth. The appraisal treated the wet ground almost like a liability. The useful acreage was north of it. The house, barn, road access, and pasture were what mattered. The swamp was simply attached. Mara understood the logic. She had spent nearly everything she had to buy the property. She needed land that could produce something. Not 40 acres that swallowed boots. For the first few months, she ignored it. She repaired fences, patched the barn roof, cleared brush from the old pasture. Every dollar had a destination before she earned it. Then the first heavy spring rain came. Water spread across the southern ground until the swamp seemed twice its normal size. Something else appeared with it. Long, dark shapes. Mara noticed them while repairing a fence near the wetland edge. At first she thought they were fallen trees. But fallen trees didn't usually lie like these. Several were almost parallel. Others seemed strangely straight with no visible root balls. One afternoon she pushed a metal rod into the mud. Beside one it struck wood. She moved 10 feet. Wood again. Another 15. Another hard knock beneath the mud. Mara began marking the spots with orange survey flags. 5914. Within 2 hours, 23 orange flags stood among the reeds. She didn't know what they meant yet. That evening, she walked back to the farmhouse and pulled out the documents that had come with the property. She was looking for treasure. She was looking for an explanation, because somebody had looked at this farm before her and decided what every acre was worth. They had measured the buildings. They had measured the pasture. They had measured the usable ground. But Mara was beginning to suspect something important. They had valued everything they could see, and almost everything interesting about the southern 40 acres was hidden underneath the water. The next morning she returned with a shovel. By sunset, she had uncovered the end of the first black log, and carved into its dark surface was something she hadn't expected to find. A clean, unmistakable cut made by human hands. Mara returned before sunrise with a shovel, a pry bar, and more curiosity than any sensible plan. The cut she had uncovered the evening before bothered her. Trees fell naturally. They snapped in storms, they uprooted when the ground became too wet, but they didn't leave flat ends. She stepped into the water and began digging around the exposed trunk. Every shovel of mud released the sour smell of old leaves and stagnant water. Roots wrapped around the log like wire. Mosquitoes gathered around her face. After an hour, she had exposed less than 4 feet. The trunk kept going. She pushed the pry bar beneath it and leaned down with all her weight. Nothing whatever was under the mud had been there long enough for the swamp to build itself around it. Mara eventually gave up on moving the log by hand. Instead, she cleaned one end. The more mud she scraped away, the stranger it looked. There was no root flare, no broken fibers from a storm. The end was almost level, not fresh, not perfect, but cut. Someone had felled this tree. The question was when she brought out the chainsaw. If the trunk was rotten, she figured the blade would settle the mystery quickly. The chain touched the black surface. Dark fragments sprayed outward. For the first inch, Mara saw exactly what she expected. Stained wood, mud, softened material. Then the saw bit deeper. The sound changed, so did the sawdust. Mara eased off the throttle. She looked down. A streak of warm brown ran through the black debris around her boots. She cut another inch. More appeared. Then pale, solid wood. Mara shut off the saw. For several seconds she simply stared. The swamp had made the outside of the trunk look almost burned, but beneath that dark exterior, parts of the interior appeared far more intact than she had expected. She pressed the point of her knife into the fresh cut. It didn't sink through like pulp. That did mean the log was valuable. It did even mean the whole trunk was sound. But it meant one thing: she had been wrong about what was under her feet. Over the next several days, Mara tested more of the shapes she had marked. Some disappointed her immediately. One crumbled near the end, another was hollow. A third was so badly deteriorated that she could pull pieces away with her hands. Then she found another solid one. And another. They weren't all preserved equally. That made the good ones more interesting. Mara started noticing a pattern. The deepest logs seemed different from the ones lying near the surface. Buried beneath saturated mud, some had spent years in conditions where very little fresh air could reach them. She didn't yet understand the science, but she understood the contradiction. The swamp everyone assumed had destroyed these trees might also have helped some of them survive. And there was another mystery. The logs were too numerous, too straight, too strangely arranged. Mara stood among her orange flags one evening and looked across the water. These weren't too simply trees that had fallen here. They had come here, which meant somewhere in the history of this worthless swamp. Someone had been moving timber, and for some reason hundreds of logs had never left. Mara spent the next week trying to understand something that seemed impossible. If those logs had been underwater for decades, why hadn't all of them rotted away? She started with the simplest assumption: water-preserved wood. It was a good explanation. It was also incomplete. What mattered was to simply that the logs were wet. What mattered was what the water and saturated mud could keep away. Oxygen. Near the surface where water levels changed and air could reach exposed wood, decay had taken its toll. Mara had already seen the evidence: soft ends, hollow centers, trunks that broke apart when disturbed. But some of the logs buried deeper were different, down in saturated sediment. Conditions could become oxygen poor. The fungi and other organisms responsible for breaking down wood did not necessarily work there the same way they did on a fallen tree exposed to air. The swamp hadn't frozen time. It had slowed parts of the process. That distinction mattered. And suddenly, the pattern Mara had noticed began to make sense. She returned to her flags with a steel probe and a notebook. This time she wasn't merely counting logs. She was recording depth. The shallow ones were easy to locate. Some were barely covered by mud. The deeper trunks took longer. She pushed the probe down until metal struck something solid. Marked the depth, then moved to the next location. 3 feet 4. Nearly 6 in one pocket of the swamp. She added notes beside the logs she had already tested. Shallow, badly deteriorated. Medium, uncertain, deep, solid sample. It was a perfect rule. Some deep logs were damaged. Some shallow ones remained surprisingly hard. Species, age, sediment, water conditions, and the condition of the tree before it sank could all change the result. But Mara no longer saw 1,700 identical logs. She saw 1,700 unknowns. That was more useful. She also realized something else. Pulling them out carelessly could destroy exactly what had allowed some of them to survive. Once removed from the saturated mud, the wood entered a completely different environment. Drying too quickly could bring its own problems. Cracks, checking, distortion, turning an impressive old trunk into expensive firewood. So Mara stopped pulling. For the next several weeks, she mostly measured, probed, marked, cut small samples only where it made sense. Her neighbors noticed the orange flags multiplying. One afternoon, a man from the next property leaned over the fence. "You planning to farm that mud?" Mara smiled. "Not exactly." He looked at the black water. "Then what are you doing?" Mara looked down at her notebook. She still couldn't answer him. Not yet, because knowing why some of the logs had survived created a much larger question. If the swamp had kept them hidden for generations, what kind of timber had it been keeping? The answer didn't come from the wood. It came from the way the logs were lying. By early summer, Mara had marked enough of them to see something she couldn't recognize when there were only 23 orange flags. There was a pattern. She spread a rough map of the swamp across her kitchen table and marked every submerged trunk she had located. Most weren't scattered evenly. They clustered along a narrow corridor running through the southern acreage, and many pointed in roughly the same direction. Mara stared at the map. A storm could knock down dozens of trees. Floodwater could move them. But this looked different. The next morning, she returned to one of the shallowest logs and cleaned several feet of its surface. Near one end, beneath layers of black staining, she found another flat cut. Then she found a second trunk with the same feature. And a third. These trees hadn't simply grown here and fallen. At least some of them had been cut before they entered the swamp. That changed the mystery completely. Mara began looking at the land differently. She stopped asking what the swamp was now, and started asking what it might once have been. Near the eastern edge, half buried beneath vines, she found a line of stones. At first they looked natural. Then she cleared the brush. The stones continued, too straight to ignore. Farther down were pieces of old timber so deteriorated that they collapsed when touched. None of it proved exactly what had happened there. But together, the clues suggested that people had once used this wet ground very differently. Perhaps timber had been staged nearby. Perhaps logs had been moved along water when transportation by river or flooded channels was practical. Perhaps some had escaped, sunk, or simply been abandoned when operations changed. Mara refused to turn guesses into history. She needed evidence, so she began searching local records and asking older residents what they remembered about the property. The stories weren't identical. One person remembered hearing about logging farther upstream. Another said an old timber route had once crossed the valley. Nobody could tell Mara exactly why her swamp contained so many trunks, but the possibility was enough to send her back into the water. She began examining the logs for repeated signs of human handling. Flat ends, old cuts, similar dimensions, clusters that followed the lowest part of the landscape. The swamp slowly stopped, looking like a graveyard of fallen trees. It began looking like the remains of a forgotten working landscape. And that distinction mattered, because naturally fallen timber could be almost anything. But timber deliberately cut and moved by people had once been worth someone's labor. Someone had selected those trees. Someone had felled them. Someone had tried to move them. Then something had gone wrong. Mara stood beside one enormous black trunk and measured its diameter. 34 inches. The next was 37. Another exceeded 40. She wrote the numbers in her notebook. For the first time, she wondered whether the real mystery wasn't why the logs had survived. Maybe it was why anyone had left them behind. But before Mara could find out what the timber might be worth, she made the mistake that nearly convinced her to abandon the entire project. She pulled out too many logs, too quickly, and within days, some of them began to split. Success made Mara careless. The first 3 logs she had pulled from deeper mud looked better than anything she had expected. Their surfaces were black and scarred, but beneath them was solid wood, so when the ground hardened enough to bring equipment closer to the swamp, Mara stopped thinking in samples. She started thinking in numbers. 5 logs became 12. 12 became 27. By the end of the week, black trunks were lined along the edge of the field like enormous sleeping animals. For the first time, Mara could actually see what had been hidden beneath her property. She thought the hardest part was over. It wasn't. 3 days later, she heard the first crack. It came from one of the largest trunks. A sharp sound split the quiet morning. Mara walked toward it and saw a fracture running from the exposed end deep into the log by afternoon. Another had begun checking, then another. The surfaces that had remained saturated beneath the swamp were now exposed to sun and moving air. Mara had spent weeks learning why some of the timber survived underwater. She had spent almost no time learning what could happen after it came out. That mistake cost her. One log she had been especially excited about developed several deep splits. Another revealed internal deterioration only after she cut into it. A third looked beautiful on one face and nearly useless on the other. The pile beside the swamp no longer looked like treasure. It looked like a warning. Mara covered the remaining trunks and stopped the recovery operation. Again, then she made an even more painful discovery. Finding solid wood didn't automatically create a buyer. She contacted a small lumber operation and described what she had recovered. The response was cautious. How long had the logs been submerged? She didn't know what species were they. She was too certain. Had anyone inspected them for embedded metal? No. How were they being dried? She didn't have an answer for that either. The questions dismantled the story Mara had already begun telling herself. Old did not automatically mean valuable. Black did not mean rare. Large did not mean usable. And a log could contain beautiful wood while still costing more to recover, transport, mill, and dry than someone would pay for it. That evening, Mara walked between the 27 trunks. She placed a hand against the split in the largest one. For the first time since finding the swamp timber, she wondered whether everyone else had been right. Maybe these weren't T-1700 assets. Maybe they were 1700 problems buried somewhere inconvenient. She could have stopped there. Instead, Mara changed the question. Until then, she had been asking, "How many logs can I pull out now?" she asked. "How many of these logs can actually become usable lumber?" The difference would reshape everything that followed. She selected one of the better trunks, not the biggest, not the darkest, the one that appeared most stable. Then she arranged to have it opened properly when the first slab finally separated from the log. Everyone in the shed went quiet, because underneath that black exterior was a surface Mara had never seen before. And for the first time, someone who understood timber looked at her and said, "Don't cut another one until we know exactly what you got." The saw entered the log slowly. Mara stood several feet back, arms folded, watching the first cut travel down the length of the black trunk. She had seen enough surprises to stop expecting miracles. This log could be hollow. It could contain rot that the small sample hadn't revealed. It could split the moment the internal tension changed. Or it could simply be ordinary wood that had survived an unusual journey. The blade kept moving. A dark slab began separating from the trunk. When it finally fell away, the rough exterior disappeared with it. Mara stepped closer. The newly exposed face looked nothing like the log she had dragged from the swamp. Long lines of grain ran through the wood. The surface was wet and unfinished, and its final quality couldn't yet be known. But large sections appeared sound. The man operating the mill shut down the blade. He ran his hand across the cut. Then he inspected the end grain. Interesting. Mara had learned to distrust that word. Interesting good or interesting expensive? He smiled too early to know that was to the answer she wanted. But it was the answer she needed. They cut another slab, then another. Each pass revealed more of the interior. There were defects. One section contained discoloration. Another showed the beginning of deterioration around an old wound. But there were also broad areas of usable-looking timber. The black log hadn't turned into treasure. It had turned into evidence. The mill operator explained the next problem. Even if the wood looked beautiful now, it still had to survive drying. Moisture had to leave gradually. The boards needed to be stacked correctly with space for air movement. Ends might need protection to reduce rapid moisture loss. Warping and checking could still ruin material that looked perfect coming off the saw. Mara listened carefully. She was going to repeat her first mistake. The boards were stacked with spacers between them. Covered from direct weather, monitored, then came the waiting. Weeks passed. Mara checked the stack almost every morning. Some boards moved. A few developed cracks. Several pieces were rejected. But many remained promising, and gradually the question changed again. People stopped asking why Mara was pulling rotten trees from a swamp. They started asking what she planned to make from them. She didn't have an answer yet, so she took one of the stable boards and cleaned a small section. The rough gray-brown surface disappeared. Underneath was grain that carried marks. No new board could manufacture the irregularities. Color variation and character of wood that had spent an unknown amount of time buried beneath saturated ground. Mara ran her fingers across it. That was when she finally understood the difference between what she had found and what she had imagined finding. The value wasn't in the black logs themselves. A wet trunk in a field was heavy. Difficult to transport, risky to mill, and uncertain to dry. The potential value appeared only after knowledge and labor had been added. Recovery, inspection, sawing, drying, selection, and eventually craftsmanship. The swamp had preserved the raw material. It hadn't created a business. Mara would have to do that before she pulled another log. She returned to her map. There were now hundreds of orange marks across it. She began separating them into groups: depth, diameter, condition, accessibility. For the first time, she was counting how many logs were beneath the swamp. She was estimating how many might actually deserve to come out. That process would take months, and when the final survey was finished, the number at the bottom of her notebook was larger than anyone expected. 1,700 submerged trunks. But Mara already knew the truth hidden inside that impressive number. 1,700 logs did not mean 1,700 valuable logs. Finding out which ones mattered would become the real work. Mara stopped counting logs as if they were money. That had been her first mistake. Instead, she began treating the swamp like an inventory nobody had ever completed. Every trunk received a number. Approximate diameter, depth, location, visible condition, recovery difficulty, and whenever testing could be done without destroying the wood, an estimate of whether the trunk was sound enough to justify pulling. The process was painfully slow. Some mornings she spent 3 hours in the swamp and added only 4 logs. Other days, falling water exposed entire clusters. The number climbed. Then 487. By late summer it passed 700, but Mara had learned not to celebrate totals. Log 418 was enormous but badly deteriorated at one end. Log 563 lay so deep that recovering it required nearly twice the effort of a shallower trunk. Log 611 looked perfect until a test cut exposed internal damage. Then there was log 704, smaller, closer to firm ground, surprisingly sound. It produced more usable lumber than several trunks twice its diameter. The swamp was teaching Mara that size and value were not the same thing. By autumn, she had divided the inventory into categories: high priority recovery, recoverable with extra work, high risk, and probable reject. But even the rejects mattered. If she wanted to know what actually lay beneath the farm, she could count only the beautiful ones during a prolonged dry spell. The water retreated farther than she had ever seen. A narrow channel appeared along the western edge. Mara followed it with her probe. Wood. 20 feet farther. Wood again. Then another. And another. The deposit continued beneath reeds she had assumed marked the end of it. The count crossed 1,000. Then 300 months later, after repeated surveys, corrected duplicates, and several areas being checked twice, Mara sat at her kitchen table and added the final entries. She stopped when the pencil reached the bottom of the page. 1,700, not 1,700 pieces of premium timber. Not 1,700 guaranteed profits. 1,700 old cut trunks that formed the working recovery inventory beneath the swamp. Some would produce beautiful boards. Some would come apart during recovery. Some would reveal defects only after the saw opened them. Mara understood all of that now, but she also understood something else. If she continued selling the good ones as wet logs, someone else would perform the milling. Someone else would dry them. Someone else would grade the boards, and someone else would capture most of the value. She looked toward the sample stacks beside the barn. For almost a year she had been asking how to sell the logs beneath her farm. Now the question changed. If 1,700 trunks were eventually coming out of that swamp, she needed a system capable of handling what happened after they came out. That meant Mara wasn't building a logging operation anymore. She was building a lumber business. The first serious offer sounded good until Mara did the math. A buyer wanted several of the better trunks directly from the farm. He would provide the truck. He would pay for transportation. He would accept the risk. Mara only had to pull the logs out and load them. 6 months earlier, she would have agreed before he finished speaking. Now she looked at the stacks beside the barn. A wet black trunk was only raw material. The transformation happened afterward. Recovery, inspection, milling, drying, grading, selection. Then finally, a usable piece of lumber. Mara turned down the offer. It frightened her almost immediately. The farm still needed money. The tractor leaked hydraulic fluid. Part of the barn roof needed replacing. And now she was refusing the easiest cash she had been offered. Instead, she invested in the process. At first, that meant almost nothing glamorous. More drying racks, better covered storage, a moisture meter, level foundations beneath the lumber stacks. Then she arranged regular milling instead of hauling one experimental log at a time. She hired help during difficult recoveries. 2 people could guide a trunk that had once taken Mara half a day to move alone. A second winch allowed recovery points to be changed without repeatedly driving heavy equipment through soft ground. Slowly, the operation stopped depending on brute force. It became a system. Each recovered trunk entered the ledger. Each board could be traced back to a log number. Some logs produced broad, stable slabs. Some produced only short usable sections. Others were rejected almost entirely. Nothing was called valuable until it survived the process. The first full recovery season ended with 96 logs out of the swamp. The next year, improvements in access, handling, and drying allowed several hundred more. Mara still refused to rush. Pulling a log faster meant nothing if the lumber split afterward. Meanwhile, the best finished boards began finding buyers. One became a farmhouse table. Another became a mantel. Wide slabs went to furniture makers. Smaller sound pieces became shelves, benches, and crafted items. Customers repeatedly asked the same question. Where did this wood come from? Mara would point toward the reeds. That reaction taught her something no rough log offer had. People weren't buying old wood simply because it was old. They were buying usable material with provenance, a physical connection to a place, a history, a transformation they could see. The economics changed with it. Lower-grade lumber remained lower-grade lumber. Rotten wood remained worthless, but the best material no longer left Mara's property as an unidentified wet trunk. By the end of the third full season, the recovery ledger had passed 200. The barn had become a lumber yard. The lumber yard had become a small business, and the number Mara once thought impossible no longer seemed impossible. Filton 700 was getting closer, but something else was happening at the same time. For the first time, Mara had enough finished inventory to find out what the wood was actually worth. The comparison began with a number Mara already knew, 168,000. That was what she had paid for the entire farm. 112 acres, the farmhouse, the old barn, 2 sheds, pasture, road access, and 40 wet acres that had contributed almost nothing to the original appraisal. For years, that number had represented one of the largest risks Mara had ever taken. Now another number sat on the table. It came from an independent lumber buyer who had spent most of the morning walking through the barn. He didn't care about the dramatic story first. He cared about moisture, grade, dimensions, species, defects, stability. He rejected more boards than Mara expected. That made her trust him. Then he worked through the usable inventory again. The figure he finally gave her was not a promise of profit. It was to what every remaining log was worth. It was a conservative estimate of what the dried, saleable material already sitting on Mara's racks could command in the wholesale and specialty lumber market. A little over 210,000. Mara looked at him. That S for what S already processed. He nodded. Not the wet logs, not the questionable material. What's S dry enough and good enough to sell? Mara looked through the barn door toward the swamp, the pasture, the farmhouse. The reeds. She had paid 168,000 for everything she could see from that doorway, and the processed wood already inside the barn had been conservatively valued above that. There were still hundreds of numbered trunks left to recover. For the first time, the phrase sounded less like exaggeration. The wood beneath the swamp was worth more than the farm above it, but Mara understood the sentence better than anyone repeating it ever would. The swamp had not contained 210,000 in cash. It had contained heavy, wet, uncertain logs. Between the mud and that valuation were years of work, broken cables, fuel, equipment, milling bills, rejected boards, drying losses, labor, time, and mistakes. Gross value was not profit. Potential value was not guaranteed value. Still, the irony remained when the farm had been appraised. Nearly every dollar of attention had gone toward the house, barn, pasture, and usable acreage. The swamp had been treated almost as a deduction. Now buyers drove past the pasture to get to the barn. And inside that barn was material pulled from the one part of the property everyone had assumed produced nothing. Mara closed the inventory book. The recovery tally was approaching its final entries. For years, with 700 had been a number written at the end of a survey. Soon it would become something else, a completed count, because only a few hundred numbered logs remained beneath the water. And Mara had already decided exactly where the operation would end. At log 2700, the final log came out on a cold morning almost 4 years after the first. Mara knew its number before she entered the swamp. 5700. The ledger lay open on the hood of the truck. Above that final line were 1,699 completed recoveries. Some had produced exceptional lumber. Some had barely produced anything at all. A few had broken during extraction. Many had lost sections to rot. But every numbered trunk in the original recovery inventory had finally been accounted for. Mara walked toward the western edge, carrying the cable. Experience had made the procedure almost automatic. Clear the route, set the anchor, inspect the line, pull slowly, stop if the trunk twisted. Years earlier, she would have been thinking only about the wood. Now she also watched the ground. Recovery had left marks, ruts, flattened reeds, disturbed mud, small channels where cables had dragged through saturated soil. None of it had destroyed the swamp. But Mara had learned enough to know that not destroyed was to the same as unchanged, so the final seasons had become more careful. Temporary access mats went down in soft sections. Equipment stayed outside sensitive areas whenever cables could do the work. Disturbed roots were allowed to recover before being used again, and several places were restored immediately after the final trunks came out. Log 700 lay beneath shallow water near the western edge. The cable tightened. Black water trembled, then one end appeared. Mud rolled from the trunk as it moved toward the bank. 6 feet, 1220. Mara stopped the winch twice to reposition the line. Then the final section slid onto solid ground. For a moment, nobody said anything. 4 years earlier, the first black log had looked almost impossible. Now the 1700th lay beside it in the same kind of October air. Mara cleaned one end. There it was, another old cut. Another tree that had passed through human hands generations before hers. Someone beside the winch asked whether they should start probing farther west. Mara looked across the water. She knew there was more wood beneath the swamp, natural deadfall, unmapped trunks, pieces she had never included in the original inventory. There would always be another reason to keep searching. But Woodworking 700 had been the project, not the entire swamp. Mara shook her head. We refinished. She wrote the date beside log Woodworking 700. Then she drew a line beneath it. For years, the number had represented possibility. Now it represented a boundary. The goal had never needed to become endless extraction. She had recovered the 1,700 logs she had mapped, built a business from the usable wood, and learned enough along the way to know when the work was complete. The swamp had given up its last numbered trunk. Everything after that could stay. 4 years after Mara found the first black log, a finished table stood in the farmhouse kitchen. Morning light moved slowly across its surface. Dark streaks crossed warmer grain beneath the finish. A small crack near one corner had been stabilized rather than hidden. It wasn't perfect wood. Mara preferred it that way. She placed her coffee on the table and ran her fingers across the edge. The strangest thing was remembering where it had begun. Blackwater mud, a trunk so dark that it looked ruined. 40 acres everyone had dismissed as nearly useless. Outside, the farm looked different now. The barn roof had been repaired. The northern pasture was fenced. One side of the barn held drying lumber. Another held finished inventory. A small workshop occupied the space where broken machinery had once been stored. None of it had happened overnight. 1,700 recovered logs had not become 1,700 valuable logs. Some had produced beautiful slabs. Some had yielded only a few usable boards. Some had been rejected almost completely. Mara had learned that discovery and value were two different things. Value required work. She walked down toward the swamp. Most of the orange flags were gone. So were the temporary recovery routes. Reeds had begun filling areas that had been disturbed during the final seasons. Water-covered places where equipment tracks had once been visible. Someone arriving that morning without knowing the story might still have looked across the wet ground and reached the same conclusion buyers had years earlier. Unproductive, difficult, worth less than the pasture beside it. Mara understood why. People were good at valuing things they could measure immediately. Buildings, acres, machinery, standing timber. The swamp had required a different kind of accounting. First, its value had been hidden beneath water, then inside blackened trunks, then inside boards that still had to survive milling and drying. Even after all of that, only the right pieces had become valuable products. Mara stopped where the first log had surfaced years earlier. Another dark trunk was visible beneath the water nearby. It had never been part of the numbered inventory. Years ago, she would have reached for a survey flag. Now she simply watched a frog climb onto the exposed end. Then she continued walking. She had pulled 2,700 black logs from beneath the swamp. That number was real. So was the value they created. The saleable lumber produced from them had eventually been valued above what she had paid for the entire farm. But neither fact was the lesson Mara remembered most. The important part was that Woodworking 700 logs had never been Woodworking 700 identical treasures. Each one had required a decision: recover it, inspect it, reject it, dry it, use it, or accept the loss. At the top of the hill, Mara turned around. The farmhouse stood on one side, the barn on the other. Beyond them stretched the dark wet ground that had changed both when people first looked at this property. They had valued everything above the surface. Mara had learned to look beneath it. And beneath land everyone had dismissed, she found something no ordinary appraisal had known how to price. Not treasure waiting to make someone rich, a resource waiting for someone to understand it. That was the difference. The swamp had hidden 1,700 logs for generations. Mara pulled every numbered one of them out. What made the discovery valuable was to simply finding them. It was learning what to do with them once they finally reached the surface.